Great. So welcome everyone to the next in our educational theory mini-series, which is part of our TTA's summer sessions. So my name is John Nichols. I know some of you are familiar faces and have been to some of the previous of the sessions of the educational theory mini-series. So it's great to see some more of you coming back again. Today we're going to go through a whole range of stuff on motivation and priming. And motivation and priming is really interesting. Now, there is some reference to previous sessions, which I think some of you will have attended. But obviously, for people watching the recording, if you haven't attended some of the previous sessions, you may find it helpful, but you will still hopefully understand most of what's going on, because I'll try and make it as accessible as possible, even if you haven't. But it will be some references to the previous sessions, which were on schema theory first. Cognitive load theory was the second one. And then we had a session on metacognition as well. So if you didn't join those sessions, then please don't panic too much. We can hopefully fill you in on the gaps. But if you want to go and catch up, then those are all recorded and they're available on TTA's YouTube channel. So let's get cracking then. So priming and motivation. What are we going to be covering today? The first thing we're going to be covering today is about what priming is. Some of you may have heard of it. Has anyone heard of priming at all? Ominous silence and no hands up, so I'm going to guess not that many people. So we're going to be covering priming, what it is and what really it means. We're going to then look at the explanation behind why priming works in relation to schema theory and cognitive load theories. This is where we do really refer back to some of those previous sessions in the educational theory mini-series, but don't worry, we will try and make it as straightforward as possible, even if you haven't had a chance to join those sessions or to watch the recordings here. Then we're going to move on to talking about motivation in general. We're going to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which most people tend to have heard of. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to look at the nature of these and the nature of how habits and token economies can interplay with these, which is just a brief overview of some of the factors around motivation that we should be aware of. And then lastly, we're going to look at how intrinsic motivation interacts with priming and give some models as to why that might be going on, and hopefully all the way through give you plenty of relevant examples as to how this might work in your own practice. I mean, one example of how this might work in your own practice is how I've tried to model it in the educational theory mini-series anyway, because I'm sure those of you who have been on all of the educational theory mini-series sessions will have noticed me talking about priming before, which is ironic, because that's me trying to give you a bit of a reference as to what's coming up. So let's go for it without any further ado. Questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand. We'll try and address them as we go through. So first one, what is priming? What are we even talking about? So no one's heard of it, I'm presuming, at the moment. Is that correct? Can anyone give me an attempt to define it? No. Okay, so priming is about introducing material prior to the students actually needing to cover it. So you're almost teaching a little bit of something or mentioning or exposing them to something which they don't need to learn yet. So this could be, for example, in previous sessions of the educational theory mini-series, when I've mentioned about priming or I've mentioned about things that are coming up. And the reason for doing this is because it then gives people more awareness of the ideas so that they're less unfamiliar. Okay. Now, priming it can take place in a lot of different contexts. It can take place in any subject. You could be teaching a novel in English, and you can say, oh, this novel is a little bit like another novel which you think they might cover or they might want to read in future. In history, you can often refer to other periods of history which they may not have covered yet, but which are likely to potentially come up in future. Or even if they don't come up at all, it still potentially counts. And then you have priming obviously in science or in maths, where you're referring to, but with a little bit of supporting explanation, you're referring to slightly more advanced concepts or ideas, especially when they relate to the content you're covering at the moment. So for example, we could say, oh, we were teaching very young children about plants. So if they can name like a leaf and a stem and the roots of a plant, you might then start talking about things like, oh, the leaves can make food for the plant. And then that will get the students thinking, oh, how on earth does that happen? And you can say, well, it's called photosynthesis, but you don't need to learn it yet. And the fact that they hear these things, you may think, well, what's the point? They're just going to get confused. But actually, the evidence we have so far suggests that doesn't happen. When this is managed well, and it's done in the context that they understand, so they already know what a leaf is because they've learned what a leaf is, they're already learning about plants. When it's done carefully in a context that is relevant to the student and which they can understand, then this is really, really useful to be able to give them advanced warning of content that's coming up further on down the line. So that when they do hear photosynthesis for the first time ever, it's not the first time. In reality, they've actually heard it before, and now they're getting ready to cover it properly, but they're like, oh, I've heard of this a couple of times. I never really knew what it was. So priming is this idea of exposing it's prior exposure, effectively. It's giving prior exposure to concepts and ideas before they come up in the curriculum or in the course. So when can we do priming and what forms can it take? So it doesn't really matter how you expose the students to this, except for a couple of key points. Number one, the student needs to be able to understand the context in which the content that's being primed is introduced. So if I'm trying to teach you German and I just talk to you in German and you don't speak any German yet, and I don't give you any English translation for any of the words, that's not priming. Okay, well, I suppose on a very limited sense it is, but it's not going to be very useful priming, because I'm just going to get given a load of words, no understanding of what they mean, no understanding of the grammar. If you want to do priming effectively, we need to make sure that students understand the context that relates to the topic or the concept that's being primed. So, for example, in the example I gave a moment ago about young children learning about plants and then having photosynthesis mentioned to them, the parts of a plant would be relevant to them and they would understand them, right? That would be what they're supposed to be learning. Now, they don't need to learn about photosynthesis, but you can relate it directly to a context that they're familiar with, that they've grasped. And even just for a young child to be able to say photosynthesis or be able to say what it is in one sentence, if you can teach them that, even just being able to say that would be for them quite an achievement, and you can make them feel quite good about themselves and quite clever. So priming can take place when we're actually teaching content. Priming can also take place when we're assessing content. Now, it's most likely this is going to be informative assessment. Now, formative assessment is when we're assessing students to see what they've learned and to check understanding and to try and use it as a learning opportunity, rather than summative assessment, which is like an end of year exam, sit there in silence. But if we're doing formative assessment, which we should be doing very regularly as tutors, then we can do formative assessment and intersperse it with references to topics that might come later. Now, they might be the harder questions that are less familiar to the students. They're including examples which maybe they need to do a bit more hard thinking about, or problems which have not directly encountered. But with those examples, that can be really useful. Number one, that can be really good for giving some stretch and challenge work for more advanced and more able students. And number two, that also is introducing them to something which is coming up later down the line. And again, if they've had to think about it quite carefully in an assessment before, then as soon as it comes up to them, they'll already think it's quite relevant, because they're like, oh, this is why I couldn't get that question right, or why I found that question difficult. So priming can take place at any point, but the important thing is it needs to be in a relevant context. They need to understand a bit of the context to make it useful. Another key point for priming is they need to really pay attention to it at some point. You can't just mention things in passing and expect they'll all sink in, because humans are very, very, very good at not paying attention to things which your brain considers irrelevant and unrelated to anything you need to know about. So if you just put a poster on the wall in wherever you do your tutorials, like you can go into if you go to the student's house, or if you've got a poster behind you, unless the student at some point pays attention to that, it's not going to make much difference. You see a lot of displays in schools. Now, this could be quite nice. They obviously look quite good, and you hope that eventually the students will look at them and won't damage them in any way or something. But it's not very reliable if you don't check that the students ever have seen it. If the students have never noticed it, then it's not going to take anything away from it. So priming can take many forms, but we really want to make sure that the context is understood by the students. They understand whatever it is that we're doing beforehand, so that whatever we're priming them with relates to that, and they get the link. We also want to make sure that they actually pay any attention to it. If we just mention it in passing and don't ask them any question about it, or don't check they've actually heard what we've said, it might not be very reliable. And priming can take place at any point. Don't think that you've only got to do this at the end of a topic or at the end of a lesson. You can do this at the beginning. You can say, oh, it does this because of quantum mechanics. But don't worry, you don't need to learn all about quantum mechanics just yet, but it's really fun and it helps to explain why X, Y, and Z. So I've got a story, I think I've said on one of the other of the education mini series, where I once was asked to teach a boy physics. And it was a classic case of the mother telling me, my son really, really dislikes physics. He doesn't want to learn physics at all. So the challenge was get him to pass his GCSE and to at least want to do some revision. Well, if not want to do some revision, to do it willingly and not have to be forced. So what I did was we started referencing things in physics that actually were quite cool, like quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was one of the examples, and said to him, oh, this is really cool, like quantum mechanics. And then giving him very, very short, simplified explanations, but always leaving a sort of a cliffhanger, leaving a bit of stuff that we haven't touched on, and then just moving on and going through other things. And we built up a bit of a rapport with him anyway. About 4, 5, or 6 lessons in, the lad asks, what is quantum mechanics? And his mum was actually within earshot and was absolutely astonished that this boy, who she previously thought had hated physics, never wanted to go near physics with a barge pole, has asked someone what quantum mechanics is. Now, it's just priming. I've just given him so many I'd literally mentioned it 2 or 3 times every lesson in a relevant context, so that eventually he felt like he was missing out on something. So it can take place at any point. Don't feel like you have to do it at the end. It can be very, very effective taking place at the beginning. It might even be that you do priming in the beginning of a lesson or a course for something which is actually coming in that course later on itself. So do we all think we understand what priming is now? Definitely check that we all understand. Got 1 thumbs up. If I was to pick on somebody, okay, a couple more. So hopefully when I do pick on someone in a minute to tell me what priming is, people are going to have some idea. We're introducing content before it formally needs to be covered. So this is not make or break yet. They don't need to know this yet, but we're mentioning it to them. We're exposing it to them in a relevant context, so they've got a bit of awareness of what it is. It's not completely unfamiliar to them anymore. So why would this work? Because a lot of people in the past, especially when I was training as a teacher, said, oh, no, don't mention this to them. They don't need to know it. Did anyone have that experience when they were training to be a teacher? If anyone was indeed trained to be a teacher or a tutor, did anyone have the experience of people saying, don't teach this, they don't need to know it? That happened to anyone? Not sure. Well, that happened to me when I was training to be a teacher. This was about, well, over 15 years ago now. But it happened to me when I was training to be a teacher. And what I've realized since is actually it wasn't very good advice. Now, okay, fine. You don't want to bamboozle the students. You can't go way over their heads. But introducing them to things they don't need to know yet actually really works. But why? It doesn't seem that intuitive. It seems like it's just going to confuse them. Now, there are 2 explanations, and this is where we come into linking to schema theory and to cognitive load theory. Now, does anyone remember what schema theory is? Anyone? Give it a go. Patricia, well volunteered.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, John. Yes, I think it's the networks that you build, like those that are pre-existing and those that you are going to develop in order to do some connection between them.
Brilliant. So a schema theory is an explanation for how we remember information, and the hypothesis is that we remember information by having complex interrelated networks of related concepts. So we link things like our mother to our family and to nice times and memories that we've hopefully had with her. We would link things like a house to bricks, mortar, bedrooms, bathrooms, and all the things we'd expect of in a house. We don't link a house to robotic machinery, because presumably you don't have a lot of robotic machinery in your house. Whereas if you were talking about a car factory, you wouldn't make that connection. So schema theory is about making connections between related ideas and having rich, dense networks of things that we understand well. So, for example, if you've read a book, let's say, has anyone here read any Roald Dahl book? Like, I don't know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Has anyone read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Right, one person at least putting their thumbs up. So you know the plot. You know a few things about the book. You know the characters in the book. You know some of the things that happen. You know that there's chocolate involved and that there's Willy Wonka, the chocolatier, and he's a bit mysterious. You know these things. They're all related bits of information. And on their own, they're not in isolate. Okay. Charlie is not the only. Charlie is a common name. It's not the only place you've ever heard the name Charlie, presumably, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And chocolate is a concept that you link to lots of other things. If I was to say Cadbury's, you probably think chocolate. Okay, but these things are all related in that network of information. That when we start thinking about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the book, okay, we can think of things like chocolate, there's characters, and all the rest of it. So schema theory is about making links between these different ideas to enable us to remember them. We recover memories by their links to things that we're asked about. This is why when people say, "Give me a fact," it's actually really hard because you don't have any link to link it to. If they say, "Give me a fact about your family," or "Give me a fact about the United Kingdom," it's much, much easier to go, "Well, actually, I know something about the United Kingdom. It's got a flag and it's called the Union Jack," right? But if someone just says, "Give me a fact," you're clever, you're a tutor, and that's actually quite hard. Well, what am I supposed to give you a fact about? And you maybe have some go-to thing in your head, but it's quite tricky. So how does this relate to priming? Well, priming is about deliberately making some links between an unfamiliar idea that someone doesn't need to understand yet and something they do actually know. So that when there's a good chance that at least a recollection of having heard of it will be retained, right? And that's what's trying to be achieved. We're not trying to mean that we're not introducing and teaching the whole topic of photosynthesis if we're telling it to a 7-year-old, right? We could just say, "Oh, this is a leaf. It does something called photosynthesis. It's really cool. It makes food." That could be it. Now, no one can say they've learned all about photosynthesis yet. They've only heard about it, and that's all we need. Doesn't need to have been covered in detail. Doesn't need to have been assessed in great detail. They don't need to have remembered everything we've told them. They just need to have heard about it. And because they've heard about it in a relevant context, they can build those links between their schemata. Schemata just being the plural of a schema. And a schema relates to an individual concept or idea. So we want to make links between an unfamiliar idea that we've not yet fully covered and something they know about, so that they'll retain that link and they'll remember they've heard of this. Yeah. Very, very hard to do priming. Well, it's probably impossible to do priming effectively if you try and link it to something they don't even know. It's just too difficult. They just don't have any link. They don't have any connection there. They don't make any connection between anything they already know and what you're telling them. It's going to be impossible. The second one is about cognitive load theory. So does anyone remember what cognitive load theory is? I'm going to exempt Patricia from this, and if no one volunteers, I'll try and pick someone who I hope was in the lesson. Helen, do you know anything about cognitive load theory? I don't remember if you did join that session.
I did, and okay. I'm rapidly thinking about it. So I've got to guess because I wrote it down, but can't remember where I put it.
Don't worry.
Yes, I think it's don't give them too much.
That was a big part of it. So I'm very, very glad that came back from your memory. Yeah. A big part of it of cognitive load theory is about not presenting too much information to students at the same time because you overwhelm their cognitive capacity. Working memory is very limited, probably only 4 chunks of information. It's like 4 schemata that you can process at the same time. And that would include stimulus from the outside world as well. So we can only process a limited amount of information. So try and reduce the amount of information they're processing at the same time, because don't forget, actually building connections is some of that cognitive load, and that's the germane cognitive load, which we want. We want them to build connections between a new idea that they don't know yet and existing things they already know. Extraneous load was about how that information is presented. Is it in a very complicated diagram, or is it quite a simple, straightforward diagram? And intrinsic load is simply the complexity, the number of different parts to what we're introducing to them. And we can have a load of debate about whether intrinsic load can be changed or not, or in how we measure it, all those things, but we don't have to worry about that now. But the point of priming is that it makes the extraneous load reduced and it makes germane load more efficient, so that the same amount of cognitive effort creates more connections. Okay, because we've already got some links already to this, so we can attach things more easily. If you just introduce photosynthesis for the first time in year 8 and they've never ever heard of it before, they've never heard any of the words that like the Greek roots, they don't understand anything about it, then it's going to be an uphill battle. If they've heard of this 3 or 4 times and someone's drummed into them, the word photo generally means light and synthesis generally means making things, then actually it's not so bad. It's not so bad. They can start making connections much quicker. The extraneous load is reduced because they're a bit more familiar with some of the things that are being presented to them. So cognitive load theory, we can't overwhelm people, and we reduce the chance they'll be overwhelmed if they've already heard of stuff. Yeah, they don't have to spend quite so much effort remembering how to even say the word if they can already say it. They already remember hearing it before. Okay, so I hope you don't feel as though you need to have been in the whole session and memorized everything about schema theory and cognitive load theory to be able to understand this. But the principle is these theories and ideas tie well together, which gives us a bit of reassurance they're probably onto something. They might not be perfect. There probably are going to be issues with these, and I can point some of them out to you later if we really want to. But there is something here. They do seem to be linked, and there does seem to be a valid explanation that makes sense empirically as to why priming can actually work, and it's not just confusing people. So don't worry about giving people links in a relevant context to more advanced material. Doesn't necessarily just mean they're going to get confused. You don't need to have covered the whole thing, and it does work. So we're going to move on now to motivation. Okay, we all want our students to be motivated, right? I'm presuming everyone would say yes if they were going to say anything. So we all want our students to be motivated, and there are a lot of people have heard of 2 big forms of motivation. Okay, so the first is intrinsic motivation. This is how someone having motivation to do something because they want to do it. Right? No one's told them. Now, intrinsic motivation can be instinctive. Okay, for most people, if I say, do you want to eat a chocolate cake, or do you want to have a back massage, or do you want to go on a holiday in the sunshine, you would say yes without anyone needing to force you, because you think this thing is going to be nice. It's going to be a pleasurable experience, right? So if someone's going to do something or give something, or you're going to have the opportunity to do something which you're going to enjoy, then you will have intrinsic motivation. No one needs to tell you to do it. You will just do it on your own. You want to do it, right? Some of these things are instinctive. Okay, so for example, wanting to eat and wanting to drink are instincts. No one needs to be taught these things. And apart from very, very extreme and bizarre psychological circumstances, you're always going to want to eat and drink. You're always going to want to meet friends and socialize with friends and people that are nice to you. You're always going to want to do these kinds of things. Now, that's intrinsic motivation. There's non-instinctive intrinsic motivation, which are things you've trained yourself to like, if you like. And you may have not been trained by yourself. You may have been trained by somebody else. But if you've developed a habit, which we're going to come on to in a second, that actually you always associate going to the pub with a good time, then you might enjoy going to the pub. But it's not instinctive. There are people in other countries who don't enjoy going to the pub, or there are people in the UK who don't enjoy going to the pub, that don't find that a pleasurable experience. And there are some people, my parents included, who love going to the pub. They always meet their friends there. They always expect when they go to the pub they can have a nice time. So intrinsic motivation can be instinctive. So it can be things that are very, very, very basic, very instinctive. They like satisfy basic needs in most cases, or they just feel nice, versus classical conditioning, if you like. So that if you imagine like the Pavlov's dogs, people have come to just associate certain things with being pleasurable, and therefore they're motivated to do them. Doesn't necessarily mean that's going to apply to everybody else. So that's intrinsic motivation. And we've split that, if you like, into the 2 subcategories of instinctive intrinsic motivation and trained or conditioned intrinsic motivation. And now we come on to extrinsic motivation. Now, this is where the source of motivation comes from outside of you. You don't necessarily want to do this thing and you won't do it, but for the fact that someone's going to try and coerce you or persuade you. Now, very often we'll have been in a situation where our students are being extrinsically motivated by us. Now, it doesn't have to be, it can be quite outright. So sometimes people go to work because they want to be paid and they know if they don't go to work, they won't be paid and they might lose their job and whatever else, and people will be upset. This is really extrinsic motivation. Okay, you're doing something you don't really want to do, but you know you have to, otherwise bad things will happen. Okay, now in a very, very basic level, it can be, I mean, really, really basic level, it can be simply in the pain or pleasure will be inflicted on you by somebody else if you do it or you don't. So if, for example, every time you, I don't know, grab someone else's money, they whack you over the hand, okay, you will probably get to grips quite quickly with the fact that if you try and grab someone else's money, they're not going to be very happy with it and they're going to probably whack your hand. Now, I'm not trying to use a violent example because I want people to be violent, of course, but just for the purpose of the example. They might also turn around and say something like, "Oi, that's my money, get off," not be very pleased with you. Again, that's still extrinsic motivation. It doesn't need to be hard. It doesn't need to be physical. It can even just be disapproving. Okay, you might not do certain things because you know people will disapprove of it and they will think less of you. You might want to do it, but you don't want to because you know people won't appreciate what you're doing. So extrinsic motivation is this externally applied pressure from other people and from social pressures. It's not always, or in fact many times, it's not a bad thing at all. We apply extrinsic motivation onto our students to get them to do the right thing, to get them to do things that will be good for them. Because intrinsic motivation can, to a great extent, be trained. As we talked about, there's instinctive intrinsic motivation, but there's also conditioned intrinsic motivation. But extrinsic motivation can, some people have a greater or reduced ability to have foresight, to exercise foresight, to think ahead. Okay. And when they do think ahead, we get what I have started to label, and again, I've not seen this in books or literature anywhere, but quasi-intrinsic motivation, where people think so far ahead about things that they want or about in the world around them that they choose to do things without needing to be forced to do that specific thing. But in actual fact, they're thinking ahead to what consequences will be far down the line. Now, let me explain that just a little bit, because I think it's worth having as a talking point if we want to later. There are some times when people do things that it seems like they're doing it because they're intrinsically motivated, but actually they're only doing it because they're thinking about extrinsic effects way down the line. I won't be given a job. Someone will be disapproving of me in the future, or people will not like the fact that I don't have a GCSE or whatever. Okay. Now, to an extent, that's still extrinsic, but it's extrinsic quite far away. Yeah. And so it seems sometimes that students can be intrinsically motivated, when actually in reality, they're just motivated by quite a distant extrinsic factor. Yeah. Does that make sense to people? We've got a few thumbs up. Now, can you put your thumbs up if it doesn't make sense to you and you've got a question? No one's got a question. Okay, now I'm going to be mean. I'm going to start asking someone what intrinsic motivation is. I'm going to ask not the person that's just joined. Fiona, what's intrinsic motivation, please?
So intrinsic motivation is more where you do something because it feels good, or you feel like you're going to get the reward for doing it.
Oh, the reward. As soon as the first part I was fully on board with, and now as soon as we're starting to introduce a reward into it, I'm a bit nervous. Why do you think I'm a bit nervous?
Because reward sounds like something someone else is going to give to you. What I meant by reward could be more like you feel good. I was thinking about.
Oh, okay. Now I'm on board with you.
A lot of the examples you were giving, I was sounded quite negative. I was thinking about things like doing exercise or something. Quite often I feel like I don't want to do it, but I make myself do it because I know that I'll feel good afterwards.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that then in that case, I'm on board with what you're saying. Intrinsic motivation, yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right that it's what people want to do themselves. They choose to do this. They don't need any external force to it. They know they're going to feel good afterwards. And that's genuinely, I would say that's genuine intrinsic motivation. They know they will feel good afterwards. Therefore, they choose to do it. It's not being applied from an external entity. Like, it's not a person telling them, oh, I'm going to be happy with you. They just know they will feel good, right? And again, we've got that distinction between instinctive and we've got that and conditioned. Is anyone willing to give it a go as to draw the distinction between the two? Louise, I've not picked on you, so I'm very sorry, but I might pick on you now.
Sorry, was the question the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic, was it?
Oh, no, between instinctive and conditioned intrinsic motivation. So we talked about intrinsic motivation being when you want to do stuff,
right.
But we talked about the difference between sometimes it's instinctive and sometimes it's conditioned. Did you understand that, or do we?
Right, yeah. So I guess conditioned would be either growing up or whenever you've created a link between something and the outcome. Like the example you gave was, okay, you start going to the pub at a certain age, you start to associate it with a good time, and that would be conditioned.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And then instinctive would be things that just feel good instinctively, like eating nice food, for example. Nice food tastes nice, and you just want to eat it because your body is pre-programmed to try and stay alive. So you want to eat nice food, you want to have a drink when you're thirsty. These things are you don't need to be conditioned to do these things. No one needs to teach you to drink when you're thirsty. You just do it even when you're a very young child because you just feel like you've got this really strong urge to drink water. So we do have that distinction between instinctive things, which don't normally apply in academic context, right? There's very, very few academic contexts I can think of where people are intrinsically motivated to study quadratic equations, right? But they can be conditioned that they actually quite like maths, because every time they do maths, they always feel good because people are like, oh, wow, you've done so well. You're so clever. You've done such a great job, or you're top of the class, or well done. You got it all right, right? And then they can get conditioned into feeling like maths is really fun. Everyone really loves me when I'm doing maths. Equally, the opposite can happen, and they can be intrinsically motivated to avoid maths because every time they do maths, people tell them they're rubbish. So you get how this plays out. Now we're going to talk briefly just about habits. Oh, sorry, Fiona, you've got a question there before we go on to talking about habits.
So if it was a case where a student was really interested in a particular subject and they were doing a project on that, would that count as intrinsic?
Yeah, most of the time, unless there was actually, like, I don't know, they were doing this project because someone had kind of told them they have to. But I mean, in the case and obviously you might come in as a tutor and it might look like intrinsic motivation to start off with until you drill into it and they go, well, I'm only really doing this project because I know someone told me I have to, otherwise I'm never going to go to university or something. In which case you might realize, hang on a minute, how intrinsic is it really? But no, absolutely. If the student is genuinely just interested in the subject, like, I know, I had a student that was really, really interested in aeronautical engineering. He wanted to do a project on whether the space shuttle was better than disposable space rockets. And that was a genuine case where I knew this student quite well over several years, and I knew he just genuinely picked that and wanted to do that. No one had forced it. That definitely would count as intrinsic motivation. But that's probably more along the lines of being conditioned and driven by curiosity. And we're going to come on to priming in a minute, driven by wanting to fill in the gaps in the schema that you have, rather than being forced. No one was telling me I had to pick space rockets. Just like when I did my history A-level coursework, I picked a Japanese shogun. No one told me to pick a Japanese shogun. In fact, some people tried to persuade me not to pick a Japanese shogun. They said, your history teachers can't mark it. They can't help you. You'll do badly. And being also young and a bit foolish, I thought, well, stuff you, I'm going to still do it anyway. And I did quite well in the end, but it was probably a bit pig-headed of me. But yeah, intrinsic motivation. If someone wants to pick a project and they genuinely actually are curious about that project, definitely I would count that as intrinsic.
Okay, thank you.
Just be wary if a student is being presented to you as they really, really like this, says their mother, and they know they have to do it. Well, okay, is it fully intrinsic, or perhaps there's something else at play in the background? Did that answer your question, Fiona?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So now let's go on to habits, and habits can create. So we talked about conditioned intrinsic motivation, where people are sort of, they've become to associate things with being nice, and therefore they just do them anyway, right? And that's normally because they associate things which have not necessarily got a connection to pleasure with something they actually enjoy. And then the list of things that people instinctively actually enjoy is relatively small. People enjoy eating nice things, which is why often for young children, food and food rewards, and for animals, food rewards are very, very common. Do this work and I'll give you a sweetie. They enjoy drinking as well if they're thirsty, but obviously we don't tend to use that as a reward. We just give people water whenever they need it. And then they enjoy social interaction. There are a couple of other things as well which we could say that people enjoy sort of children enjoy watching cartoons, for example, or watching things like this. That comes in separate. We're not going to go into it now, but there are a couple of things that people really, really enjoy, and then anything that links to those instinctive things can then be conditioned to be something they enjoy as well. So people going to the pub, doing it because they associate it with positive social interaction with their friends. Now, habits help us to create this sense of inertia that overcomes any shortfall in motivation, because people who build a habit will tend by default to just keep following that habit without giving it much thought. Now, obviously, habits don't spring up out of nowhere. Normally, habits spring up out of things that people do and then tend to associate with being good in some way, right? So hopefully all of our children develop a habit of brushing their teeth in the morning so their teeth don't rot and fall out. And then hopefully, if we do a good job embedding that habit, they will naturally just brush their teeth in the morning, whether or not on a particular day we turn around and force them or not. Okay. I have 2 young children. I try and encourage them very much to brush their teeth every morning. And generally speaking, it's a habit. They will sometimes forget. I will sometimes not force them. But a lot of the time, if I don't ask them specifically to brush their teeth, they still will. Okay. Now, they don't really have intrinsic motivation in the same sense of they really, really want to brush their teeth. I mean, if I said, don't brush your teeth to start off with, they're probably, all right, then fine, you don't have to. Okay. But they've developed it as a habit, and habits sort of, we have this very mild intrinsic motivation just to keep doing the habits because we've always done it that way. Has anyone ever met someone, especially older people, who say, well, I have to do this because I've always done it that way? Maybe we recognize we've done this ourselves. Anyone experienced this? Someone? Yeah. So I mean, I'm sure this is quite common, right? Where we meet people and they go, well, I always eat fish and chips on a Friday. Okay, so what do you want for lunch on a Friday? They say fish and chips. Okay. But habits can be quite powerful as well, because it allows us to embed routines in people, which they will then carry through, even if it's not something they really, really want to do. Now, habits are not a bad thing. Habits can be really, really, really useful, especially in a teaching context. And they're not normally talked about in terms of motivation. Normally, people keep these very separate. And I've deliberately put these in the same place on the same slide, because when I'm talking about motivation, people are often motivated to continue their habits, regardless of whether it's something they really, really like. And that habit can often be really, really useful. So if you build in really good habits in your students, whether it's studying, whether it's how they practice, how they revise, how they approach to certain types of questions, if you build in really, really good habits, they will just carry on doing those good habits. Equally, if you build in bad habits, or you allow them to develop and retain bad habits, the same will go the opposite way. And you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware of the flip side of this. Habits can work in or against your favor, right? So habits, I keep these separate because they don't really fit into intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. There is some level of intrinsic motivation just to continue a habit, but I wanted to keep it distinct because these are things that we can use as tools. We can train our students to do things a certain way again and again and again and again until it becomes habitual. 2 words of warning here. First one, habits take time to build. They take time to change in any way. So if you're going to put a lot of effort into creating a habit, do put in a bit of thought to think, well, is this always going to be the most useful habit for them? Yeah. Are you teaching them a method which then later on down the line is not the right method to use or won't get them credit in an exam? Yeah. Be wary about what your off ramp is for when you need to change that habit, if there is a bit that you'll need to change in future. Okay. So in maths, for example, or in science, if you're teaching them a certain method, or in history or in English, if you're teaching them a certain approach to writing an answer to a question, if you drill them too much to do only answer questions a certain way, are you going to then be able to get them to change when they have to answer a different type of question? Or if they go to do A level, they don't have to do it the exact same way they've done GCSE. They need a bit more flexibility. So be careful, think ahead when you're building habits, because they can be very difficult to change. So you can always make sure that some aspect of it requires some thought and some conscious decision, but make sure you still have a base habit of sort of approach it in a structured and logical fashion. So habits, and then the second thing to warn you about with habits. So first of all, they take a long time to entrench. They take a long time to build in place. We need to think in advance as to what we want. The second thing to be aware of with habits is students will begin to follow habits automatically, and habits will tend to have a trigger. Okay, there will tend to be some trigger as to when they implement some habitual practice. So for example, it might be that I wake up in the morning, oh, it's morning time, I've woken up, I need to go and brush my teeth before or after I get dressed, or whenever they do it, whatever the habit is. Okay. Or it might be, oh, I've seen this type of question. It's question one. Question one, I always need to answer it with, I don't know, 3 points, because it's a 3-mark question, right? Or whatever it's going to be. Okay. Now, you need to be quite careful to make it clear to the student what the triggers are for a particular habit. And you can do this in layers if you think very carefully about how you teach. And I don't want to try and reduce your teaching to being too mechanistic and being just like you're becoming just a machine. But if you think carefully as to how you teach, the habits you try to build in your students, be quite clear for yourself what is the trigger for them actually implementing this. Yeah. What sorts of questions do they need to apply this method to? And how will they spot that? Because if they don't have that trigger, or they don't recognize that trigger, they won't implement that method that you might have taught them really, really well. Do any of you teach maths? One person? Or sciences? You might notice in maths or sciences there are quite a lot of questions which require them to pick a method. It doesn't just say use the quadratic equation to solve this, or use this formula to solve this. Sometimes it says, oh, here's a question. There's a car driving down the road. What's the force applied on the wall when it hits the wall? Okay, they need to pick an equation that's going to be relevant to that context. Okay, you need to be able to help them identify when to activate a certain habit. Okay, oh, that's this equation, speed equals distance over time, or force equals x, y, and z. Okay, they need to be able to know when a habit is to be activated or not. And then once the habit is activated, they'll just implement it. Okay, now last one here, token economies. I'm guessing no questions so far on habits. Everyone understands why I put habits here? Or does anyone not understand and they want to ask me a question, or they think I've done a bad job? No? Okay. Last thing I want to just go through is token economies. Because what I mean by this has a specific meaning in psychology. A token economy is when you offer people things as kind of like currency, like some kind of reward, if they do what they're told to do, or they take away this reward, this currency, if they don't. So a lot of the time we'll have children and we'll say, oh, we've got a star chart. Has anyone ever been in a situation where they've had a child with a star chart? Some people, yeah. Very, very common that we have some kind of star chart, or we give out stickers or something, some points in schools. They often have points of some description, merits or demerits, credits or whatever else they call it, or plus or minus points, any of these things. All of these things are effectively tokens. They don't have to be physical pieces of anything. They can just literally be tokens, mental tokens. Like, I'm going to give you 2 points. Okay, I don't physically have to give you anything. I just told you I've given you 2 points. Okay, now these kinds of token economies because they indicate, I mean, in the very simple sense, money is a token economy, right? We get given pound coins or £5 notes or bank account with numbers in that means that. And people associate those tokens with reward, and they associate those tokens with having some value because they want people to appreciate them. We all want to be appreciated. Okay, so children will respond to tokens even if they have no actual monetary value, right? They don't have to have any monetary value or even any reward value in sense of they don't have to be instinctively rewarding. Doesn't necessarily have to be a sweet, but they just think, oh, great, my teacher, mum, dad, whoever has given me a star. They feel appreciated. They feel like they've been recognized for doing a good thing. Now, token economies are very, very common in education and in parenting in general. They can be very effective, especially at building habits. But you should be just aware that token economies have a few potential issues, which doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. It just means you should be aware of the issues, right? One is that the value of the token can become depreciated over time. Yeah. When people first start using a star chart with children, okay, even if you're doing it for quite some time, initially the children might respond really well. After 3 or 4 years, maybe they don't really care so much about stars anymore. Yeah. The value of the stars depreciates over time. And that will depreciate faster if it's not used consistently, or if they don't have a strong sense that the awarding of stars correlates to how someone feels positively about them, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. They want the someone else to feel positively about them. They don't really care about the star. Now, the other thing with token economies is you don't want people to become dependent on token economies. You don't want to make it so that they only behave when the tokens are being given out. You want to try and use it to build good habits. That means that then when the tokens are taken away or they're not given out anymore, they still follow the behavior we want. Now, you might say, well, this sounds a little bit like brainwashing. And actually, to be honest, well, it really is. There's no definitive psychological distinction between brainwashing to do good things and brainwashing to do bad things, or just neutral things. It is training people to follow, to behave in a certain way. But obviously, we as teachers, and if you're also parents, we want to train people to behave in certain ways because it's going to be good for them. It's still acting in their best interest, right? We want to train students to answer a question a certain way, to approach, to study, and to try hard, and all the things like this. So token economies can be very useful. Bear in mind their possible limitations. Bear in mind that their value will depreciate over time. Use them to try and develop good habits. Bear in mind that that there is a risk that when you take the tokens away, when you stop giving out these rewards, that they stop feeling so motivated. You need to try and make sure that motivation is replaced somehow when the tokens are then removed. The scaffolding can't stay up on the building forever, right? If you build a building and you put scaffolding around it, you need to make sure the building can stand up when you take the scaffolding down. Does that make sense for token economies? Got at least a couple of thumbs up. Okay. Does anyone use token economies in any of their lessons, just out of interest? If you're willing to say that you do. No one does? Or does anyone not use them? Don't find they're needed? Nope, no one responding to that either. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. But token economies, often they're used a lot more with younger children, although with older children, sometimes the token economy is just money, especially for parents, not really for tutors. But yeah, just bear in mind what the pros and the cons are. Okay, last bit, manipulating motivation. Manipulating motivation, we're going to link this back to priming, because one of the factors of intrinsic motivation is curiosity. And curiosity, as far as I have been able to find, has got relatively little study in academic literature. So I'm not going to lie to you and say there's loads and loads of evidence about this. There's not. But I have some ideas and I can share them with you, and you can dispute them with me or agree with them or not agree with them or whatever you like. But effectively, when we come back to how we want to influence motivation, especially when we want to influence intrinsic motivation, which is a lot of the time what people want to do, okay? It's like the holy grail of motivation. Get people to want to do things by themselves, okay? When you want to get people to do things by themselves, curiosity is generally the way we go with any academic kind of pursuit, right? We're not likely to have an instinctive draw for people to want to study quadratic equations. They're not necessarily going to feel really, really good because they've mastered quadratic equations. They'll feel a bit good. They'll feel a sense of achievement, perhaps. But on their own, academic study is quite hard to link it directly to an instinctive need or being satisfied. So one of the easiest ways to try and do this is by satisfying their curiosity. And where does curiosity come from? So the hypothesis that I want to put to you is that probably curiosity mostly comes from filling in the gaps that are adjacent to the schemata you have that you don't already have filled in. And this is why when I've practiced priming in the past, I've always tried to make sure that there's then lots and lots of links from different places to a concept or an idea which I know the student doesn't understand, which they've heard of from different perspectives. So like the example I gave earlier with quantum mechanics, okay, lots of references to quantum mechanics in a simple context that could be understood by the student. Eventually they then ask what it is. The great thing about people asking a question is they normally listen to the answer, don't they? So if you can get them to the stage where they ask, you're in a golden position to be able to answer the question. And when you answer the question, they're likely to actually pay attention to it. So we're going to just wrap up there, and I'm going to leave some time for questions or for general discussion. Has anyone got any questions? Has anyone found this? First of all, did anyone find that there was stuff here they didn't know? Or at least more than they knew? Yeah, at least some people. Does anyone have any questions about any of it? Or feedback or dispute, if you want to dispute something, or some of this stuff is a bit hypothetical because we don't have definitive evidence for some of these things. We just have collections of anecdotes and people that have done these things and practices and found that they've been helpful, and they're just generally good. They're tips that people have found helpful. But has anyone got any question, query? Has it been good feedback? Yeah, Fiona?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I think a lot of it you sort of kind of know, but it's really good to sort of delve a bit deeper and to think about it. One thing that I was interested in as well with the intrinsic motivation is I think curiosity is really important, like that they're interested in it, but also I think in terms of students wanting to learn things, it's often if they know that it's going to be useful, not just to pass exams in the futures, but, you know, if they know learning this is going to help me with this, or I'm going to need this in everyday life, that kind of thing can also be motivating as well.
Yes, definitely. And actually, one thing we didn't really talk about is when you have combinations of motivation. So you can be extrinsically and intrinsically motivated. So people that love their job still get paid for it, right?
Yeah.
If it's a job. So then you can have combinations of motivation, which becomes even more powerful and makes it even more likely that someone will go through of actually doing what it is that they want now to do. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think some of this stuff does seem like it's not that groundbreaking and brand new. It's just about articulating it in a structured format and being able to recognize and go, yeah, actually, I'm going to make a deliberate effort to implement a token economy or not, because I want some sort of outcome from it. And it's about being a bit more structured and a bit more deliberate about some of these things, rather than just going, oh, you know what, I'll use a star chart. But yeah. Okay, Helen, have you got a question as well?
Well, it was just not a question. It was just to say that yes, it's been very useful because of fleshing out certain things and seeing, you know, especially intrinsic and extrinsic together, which is great. Like the point of getting people to want to do the thing they need to do, vitally important. And also, as for priming, I realized that I'd been doing that with a particular student, sort of introducing a little boy, 8-year-old, but very, very bright, and introducing Latin and Greek derivations of words, and then he turned it into a game. So that
brilliant.
was quite nice because he's
Brilliant.
weird and sort of quite original. So yeah. So thanks very
That's
much.
a fantastic example. Thanks so much for sharing it, because I think these kinds of things is where really this is kind of what turns someone from being quite a good tutor or teacher to being really stand out and memorable. But you can, and often people end up doing this with sort of students that are already achieving quite highly, so like relatively high attaining students, and for obvious reasons, because with low attaining students you've got so many things that you're almost firefighting with. Oh, they don't understand this, we need to go through this. We don't understand that, they need to go through that. You can still do it with lower students, it's just harder to do it on top of everything else you need to do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When you've got high attaining students, then you almost naturally go, well, you know what, you can you will understand when I've almost finished the bit I needed to teach you, because you've got it now. Let me tell you a bit more advanced stuff. And it's almost natural to do it. It's instinctive almost to do it with higher achieving students. And when they do take it and turn it into a game, or they do start producing their own derivations for themselves, that's a really positive and interesting sign. And it's great to see as well. I'm sure it's probably really enjoyable to see this chap come up with his game and play his game about like what the Latin roots or the Greek roots are for something. But no, thanks so much for sharing that, Helen. Really interesting. Patricia.
Yes, John, just to say as well, it's not a question, but just to say that those mini-series were very, very informative. And a lot of aspects would be very useful to me, because I teach French to A-level students, and they have to conduct an individual research project and cover some translation work. And often bad habits obviously need to be overcome. And that will be very useful. There will be aspects I will be focusing. So thank you once again.
I'm very glad. And as I've always said to people as well, this is all a toolbox with different tools for tutors. Obviously, they're all mental tools rather than physical hammers and things like that. But all of this toolbox, and it's up to you as professionals to work out which tool is the best tool for the job at the right time, right, with the right student. And that's what being a good tutor is about, right? This isn't about telling you teach only in a certain way. I've never ever been about doing that, because I don't think that really works very well. But it's about trying to give you different tools, so you've got different options to go to, and also you understand the rationale of why you're going to a certain method. When you're approaching a certain student, so you say, if you've identified there, Patricia, if there are some bad habits, oh yeah, actually we really need to address those, because otherwise those bad habits will just kick in every time that particular challenge comes up. So you identifying there quite consciously, there's something I need to do, and then obviously it helps to address that habit. You know what the problem is you're trying to deal with, and hopefully it'll make a big difference going forwards. And no doubt, if there's the problems that you face with some children will no doubt become the problems you end up finding with other students as well. But no, thanks so much for the feedback. Thanks so much everyone for attending. We've now come to the end. If there's no other questions, then we'll wrap up. But thank you very much all for coming. Thank you very much to those people watching it afterwards for getting to the end, I suppose. And hopefully you've all found it very useful. So thanks very much, and we'll stop the recording here, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of TTA's summer sessions soon.